Hi guys, so the question of sword edges, sword sharpness. So something that I see often stated on the internet as if it's fact is that medieval swords were not sharpened all the way down and were not very sharp. Okay, so let's address the second point there first of all. How do we define very sharp? Well, sharp enough to cut, basically is sharp enough for a sword. People often use the term razor sharp, which I won't go into, but you know, there are different types of edge that you can put on any bladed instrument, and what people often confuse is sharpness with fineness or narrowness of the edge. So clearly if you take something like a kitchen knife or a razor, which is a very thin piece of steel, and make it as sharp as you possibly can, and then you take a thick piece of steel like a sword or a bayonet and sharpen that as sharp as you possibly can, technically they can both be as sharp as each other. They can both be one steel molecule thick at the edge. That is as thin as they can possibly be, as sharp as they can possibly be at the edge. So they can be equally sharp. However, the way that they act upon a target, be that a body or tatami mats or of wood or something else you're cutting, works a little bit differently because of the angles of the blade behind the actual edge itself. So the question of sharpness is a confusing one perhaps, and one that people can get a bit muddled over. But let's just address this on sword sharpness. Swords, medieval European swords were sharp, and were generally sharp for the entire length of the blade. What do I say this based upon? I say this based upon I have personally handled and examined, I would imagine at least a couple of hundred, I haven't counted them, but I would imagine at least a couple of hundred medieval and early Renaissance swords in my life. Thankfully, I've been very lucky to, in places such as the Wallace Collection, the Royal Armouries in Leeds, the Park Lane Arms Fair, at auctions, Sotheby's for example, Christie's, and so on and so on. So I've been lucky enough to have the chance to handle a lot of swords from this period, and going all the way back to the Dark Ages as well, back to 8th century, 9th century blades. There's a nice example in the Wallace Collection which I had a play with a couple of times in fact. And the fact is that the edges on many of these swords are still sharp, and this is something perhaps surprising to some people, that some of the swords, if you look at, for example, the mid-15th century swords, probably from the Battle of Castillon, which were found in the River Dordogne. Ewart Oakeshott wrote about them in the journals of the Park Lane Arms Fair, and also in a couple of his books. He mentions them in Records of the Medieval Sword, for example. And they came out of the river. They'd been in the sludge at the side of the riverbed, and because it was very oxygen free in that environment, they didn't really corrode very much. They discoloured, and some of them warped and went in strange shapes, but they didn't actually rust away or corrode very much at all. The wooden grips and the leather on the grip disappeared, and any remains of scabbards disappeared, but the steel remained in remarkably good condition, and some of those came out of the water and in fact remain today both in public and private collections, sharp enough to sharp enough to use actually as a sword. So the fact of the matter is that medieval swords were generally sharp from the base right at the bottom at the crossguard all the way along to the tip. Now, I think where people often get the idea of swords not being sharp all the way along the edge, or medieval swords not being sharp all the way along the edge, is perhaps from certain types of two-handed sword and longsword, which either have a ricasso at the base or are actually perhaps a little bit blunt down here. And clearly any swords that are designed to be fingered, that is held with the finger over the quillon, are generally either have a ricasso at the bottom, a ricasso being the blunt section at the base of the blade that's thicker, usually sort of almost rectangular in cross section. or indeed they're just thicker down there so you wouldn't obviously hurt your finger using it like that. But equally I think that sometimes people look at, for example, Vardy's statement about a longsword which is, he says, sharp for, I think he says 4 fingers at the tip, and the rest of it to be blunt. But he's specifically talking about a special kind of sword for half-swording, for fighting in armour. So it's not a normal longsword, it's not the normal kind of longsword that you would use out of armour or that you would carry wearing when you're riding through the countryside. It's a specific type of armoured duelling sword. So the typical medieval longsword is sharp from very, very near to the guard, sometimes all the way down to the guard, all the way up to the tip. Equally sharp all the way along on both edges. Okay? So there we go, medieval swords and most Renaissance swords are sharp all the way up on both the edges and are very sharp enough to cut through a piece of paper and do these kinds of demonstrations that people show on videos to show how sharp something is. Couple of other comments before I finish off. Indian swords, Japanese swords we know are sharp all the way up. Indian swords are generally also sharp all the way along. Except for the Indian swords often have what's sometimes known as the Indian Ricasso, and in fact you can see it on this sword. I don't know if you can see it in this light, but it actually has a blunt section for a few inches at the beginning there, and that is a Ricasso, much like on a European sword. It's possible that even Indian swords adopted this from European swords because they did used to import European blades into India and mount them on tulwar hilts. So maybe it was a European feature originally that they copied. I don't know. But anyway, Indian swords sometimes have that blunt portion on there. Why? I don't really know. Possibly because it's not possible to sharpen any further than that, because you usually have these languettes either side here, and you wouldn't really be able to get the whetstone close enough to sharpen the edge any further than where those languettes are. Or possibly it is because some people like to stick their finger over the quillon there for a slightly different kind of grip, possibly. And lastly, the other place where people might get the impression that swords are sometimes not sharpened all the way along or very sharp is that military swords from the 19th century in Europe were generally purchased if you were an officer, or issued if you were a ranker, as blunt objects. Okay? And the reason they did this was health and safety. The 19th century saw the introduction of concern over health and safety and things like this. It wasn't quite the litigious society that we live in today, but generally speaking they noticed that soldiers in barracks with sharp weapons were injuring both themselves and horses if they were in the cavalry, and also, you know, to an extent there's probably an economics factor in there as well, in that a sharp sword requires maintaining and the sharp edge is more easily damaged than a blunt edge. If people are carrying blunt swords around, then they're more durable and they're not going to injure themselves, other people or horses with them. So European 19th century swords were sharpened only when action was imminent, okay? And this did lead to a few mistakes, potentially in the 19th century, whereby troops went into action with unsharpened swords, which is clearly not a good thing. Allegedly, the Russian cavalry, some of the Russian cavalry during the Battle of Balaclava, there's reports from the British cavalry saying that they picked up Russian swords and they were found to be completely blunt, which obviously is good for the British cavalry, so it's possible that some of the Russians were not using sharpened swords for some reason. But certainly all the British swords in the Crimea were sharpened, or at least supposed to be sharpened, and one of the last times in history that this happened was World War I. In the British Army, the order went round to sharpen swords. So when war was declared, all the swords and bayonets got sharpened. And this was usually the job of the regimental armourer. And what's interesting is that, and this is not just true of Britain, but also France, Prussia, Spain, Italy and so on, most military swords in the 19th century are only usually sharpened from about that point upwards. And in fact, I own antique examples which have been sharpened only from about there upwards. So they're sharp where you're going to be cutting, and they're sharp where you're going to be thrusting, and where you're going to be parrying, they are blunter. However, that's not always true, I also have antique examples which have been sharpened from the very base all the way up. And I think this tends to be true particularly of soldiers serving in India, where they're fighting people with good swords, with tulwars and such like. So there you go, you could get various different types of sharpening on 19th century swords and sabres. Sometimes, like a medieval sword, from the bottom all the way up, sometimes only from about 12 inches from the hand upwards, and sometimes just the end was sharpened. So there we go, a quick and dirty overview of sword sharpening through the ages, but most important thing that I want to reiterate is that Dark Age and medieval swords were sharp, very sharp, and many of them remain sharp, and the vast majority of them were sharp for the entire edge on both of their edges. Thank you.